Hello and welcome to this short video from the Foundations in Neuroscience playlist. My name is Professor Phil Newton, and in this video we're going to consider sensory pathways. What I hope you're able to do by the end of this short video then is to be able to describe the anatomy of sensory processing. Very simply, when we receive sensory information, be it visual information, auditory information, how do we process it? How do we make sense of it and interpret what it is? The starting point then is material we've covered in other videos. We've talked about neurons. There's a cartoon of a neuron here. We've talked about action potentials. These are the electrical signals which travel down neurons in a unipolar way. We've talked a lot about how this electrical information travels around the brain, the nervous system, but we've never really considered where does it all start. And one of the places it starts is with sensory processing, with this external sensory information that comes into our nervous system. We're mostly going to focus on external sensory information, but pretty much everything that we're going to talk about applies to internal sensory information as well. So when we process information that tells us that we are, for example, hungry, that is internal sensory information that is more or less processed along the similar pathways to the ones that we're going to refer to when we talk about external sensory information, such as light or sound. We have multiple different sensory systems for external sensory information. Some of them are specialists, some of them are more general. We have somatosensory systems that process information about touch and pressure and pain. We have a visual system, obviously relating to our eyes, an auditory system with our ears, a vestibular system relating to balance and other content, the olfactory system relating to our sense of smell, and the gustatory system relating to our sense of taste. Most of these sensory systems, although they process very specific and different types of sensory information, the processing of that sensory information follows a common pathway. So we're going to talk about what that pathway is in general terms. For our example, we're going to use touch or possibly pain, starting out at one of our hands. So there's a sensory stimulus. Let's say it's a painful stimulus. We cut our finger. That sensory information then activates the first order sensory neuron, which then travels up our arm and into our spinal cord and enters our spinal cord at a specific segment depending upon whereabouts from the body the information has come from. In the spinal cord then, those first order neurons synapse onto second order neurons. These cross over from one side of the spinal cord to the other, and they ascend up the spinal cord in what is known as the spinothalamic tract. These second order neurons then enter the brain, specifically into a region of the brain called the thalamus, where they synapse then onto third order neurons. These third order neurons then carry the sensory information onto the cortex, where sense is made of it. With cortex is where we work out where the information has come from, what it means, and what we should do about it. Damage or perturbation of any step of this pathway can result in problems in sensory processing. So we're going to make our way along this pathway, starting at the beginning with the sensory stimulus, with the first order neuron. We have a variety of different specialist sensory structures that process different types of sensory information. Nociceptors, for example, are specialist neurons that are activated by stimuli that cause pain, normally as a result of damage to the tissue where the nociceptor is located. These are neurons with specialist receptors within the neuron's molecular receptors for pain stimuli. Photoreceptors, things like rods and cones in the retina of our eye, are specialist cellular structures that respond to light. In the skin, we have thermoreceptors that respond to temperature. In our blood vessels, we have baroreceptors that respond to stretch, and there are many more. The hair cells of our ear, for example, that respond to sound. Some of these are specialist cells, some of these are just specialist molecular receptors on otherwise ordinary neurons. And they're very, very specialist for turning this particular type of sensory information into an action potential. So even though there's a great diversity in the types of external sensory information that are being processed by these very specialist neurons, the net result is always the same, the firing of action potentials, as we've covered elsewhere in another video. These structures are also responsible for a very important property of our human sensory systems, and that is adaptation. If you think about a time when you've walked out of, say, a cinema into a bright, sunny summer day, or when you've jumped into the sea that was suddenly very cold, very quickly your sensory systems adapt. So although you're initially blinded by the sunlight, your eyes adapt and you're able to see normally. When you jump into the sea, provided it isn't too cold, although it may initially feel very cold, you soon adapt. Or alternately, if you get into a very hot bath, you quickly adapt. That adaptation occurs in the specialist sensory structures, and it's designed to present sensory overload, and it's normally due to some sort of cellular changes in intracellular signaling mechanisms that change the sensitivity of those specialist sensory structures, which means that their likelihood of them firing an action potential is changed. This is not the same as sensory gating, which is something that happens in the thalamus that we'll cover in a few minutes' time. Okay, so that's the first order neuron, the sensory neuron. We're now going to talk briefly about the second order neuron. These are neurons that form what we call the spinothalamic tract, an ascending sensory tract that goes up the spinal cord into the brain. The only real feature that we need to talk about with regard to these neurons is the fact that they cross over the spinal cord at some point on their journey up the spinal cord. This is a process that we call decussation, which is simply a fancy term for crossing over. Whereabouts in the spinal cord or whereabouts on the journey these neurons cross over from one side to the other depends upon the specific type of sensory information that comes in. When we say crossing over, what we mean is, for example, the sensory information that comes from our right hand will at some point cross over the spinal cord and ascend on the left-hand side of our spinal cord and then be processed by the left-hand side of our brain. And the opposite is also true. Sensory information from the left-hand side of our body will cross over and be processed by the right-hand side of the brain. We don't really know why this happens, although there are lots of theories about why it has evolved to be so. But it's obviously important for trying to understand when someone has a problem with sensory perception. If someone is feeling, let's say, pain or numbness or tingling in their right leg, that sensory information is going to be processed by the left-hand side of the brain. So if the problem is on the left-hand side of the brain, it may result in problems in sensory processing from the right-hand side of the body, or it may be in the right leg itself. And figuring out whereabouts the problem is involves a consideration of the fact that the sensory information will at some point cross over. Okay, in then to the brain, and specifically into a region of the brain called the thalamus. I'm just going to pause for a second while I show you an animation of whereabouts the thalamus is. You can see there that it's located on top of the brainstem. It's quite a large structure, but it's quite an old structure from an evolutionary perspective. Most vertebrates have something resembling a thalamus. And the thalamus is really, really important for the processing of sensory information. So we'll talk in textual terms about what it does. Very simply, it's a sensory relay station. It filters out irrelevant sensory information and lets through what it considers to be relevant sensory information. It integrates incoming sensory information, so information about touch, pressure, pain, visual, auditory, and so on. Some of the integration of those sensory streams is done in the thalamus, and some of the prioritizing is done as well. We're processing a huge amount of sensory information at any one time, and yet we're only really consciously aware of a very small amount of that. And the reason why we're only aware of a small amount of it is in part due to the actions of the thalamus filtering out sensory information that is irrelevant. In other videos, we'll talk about things like working memory and attention. These are cortical processes which have very limited capacity, and so it's important that they don't become overwhelmed, and the thalamus is an important part of making sure that they don't become overwhelmed. How does the thalamus make these decisions? It gets input and feedback from the limbic system, the emotional regulation system, the motor system, and the reticular formation. And there is also a two-way exchange of information from the cortex itself in order to decide what information to let through and what information not to let through. Pretty much all sensory information that ends up in the cortex has to go through the thalamus, with one exception, more or less, which is olfaction. Olfaction is a very powerful memory cue because it's wired directly into the limbic system and doesn't really get filtered and processed in the same way as other sensory information does through the thalamus. Another important thing that the thalamus does, or that the thalamus plays an important role in, is this phenomenon that we call sensory gating. As I said, at any one time, you are processing a huge amount of sensory information. You are able to filter out irrelevant stimuli and focus on relevant stimuli, but you are also able to rapidly switch between those. An example that's commonly used in psychology is what's known as the cocktail party effect. Very simply, if you are in a cocktail party or some other gathering where there's lots of people, and those people are then aggregated into small groups, each of which is having their own conversations, you're able to filter out the conversations that are being had by the other groups and able to focus on the conversation that you're having with the people who are right in front of you. So let's say you're having this conversation with the people right in front of you, but in a group on the other side of the room, you realize that somebody is suddenly saying your name or talking about you. You're able to switch rapidly to try and pay attention to what is being said on the other side of the room. You may then find it difficult to focus on the conversation in front of you, but you are able nevertheless to rapidly switch back and forth between those two conversations. What this illustrates is that while you were initially focusing on the conversation in front of you, you were nevertheless, in a sort of unconscious way, paying attention to the other conversations that were happening elsewhere in the room. And when some relevant, some salient information came up in one of those conversations, you were able to rapidly switch and pay attention to it. This is called sensory gating, and the thalamus is really important for this. There are other regions of the brain that are important, but the thalamus plays a primary role. Sensory gating is problematic in people with certain psychiatric conditions. Perhaps the most famous example of this is schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia find it really hard to do sensory gating, and this is thought to contribute to some of the psychiatric symptoms of schizophrenia, particularly the positive symptoms. Okay, so let's say the thalamus has decided that it wants to let through a particular piece of sensory information. It then travels via the third order neuron, the thalamocortical projection, onto the cortex. And this is where, in many ways, the most human and most complex aspects of sensory processing take place. Perhaps the most important cortical region is here. I'll just pause and let this animation play through. This is what we call the primary somatosensory cortex. It's located on the postcentral gyrus, the most anterior part of the parietal cortex. If you're familiar with Brodmann areas, it's Brodmann areas 1 to 3. If we were to rotate through 90 degrees and take a look through the somatosensory cortex, we would see that different regions of the somatosensory cortex process sensory information from different regions of the body. We wouldn't actually see these body regions as you see here in this diagram. What this diagram simply shows you is that the most medial parts of the somatosensory cortex, those are the ones, let me show you using a pointer here. These regions here, these process sensory information from, say, the hips and the legs, whereas the regions out here, the lateral on the outer surface of the somatosensory cortex, these process sensory information from the face, tongue, and pharynx. The relative size of these regions corresponds to the sensory sensitivity of these regions. Very simply, you are able to process very fine sensory information in your hand and in your face. And when I say fine, what I mean is you're able to distinguish between sensory information that's come on to a particular part of your finger versus a slightly different part of the finger. It's very sensitive compared to the sensory processing capabilities that you have on your hips and on your legs, which are not quite as sensitive and not quite as discriminatory, i.e. you're not quite as good at distinguishing between sensory information that's come from one part of the hip versus another. That's because of the different amounts of sensory cortex processing power that are dedicated to processing that incoming sensory information. Where people have damage to the somatosensory cortex, they find it difficult to localize where sensory information is coming from. So let's say someone has damage to these this region of the somatosensory cortex here, and then they have a cut on their finger. They might find it difficult to tell without looking at the finger where the pain is coming from. They'll still feel the pain, but they'll find it difficult to tell where it is coming from. So that's the somatosensory cortex. There are other cortical regions, though, that are important for processing sensory information. So here we have a simple view of the outer surface, the cortical regions of the brain. Here we have the cerebellum, which we're not going to talk about in this video. And the other regions of the brain, the cortex, I should say, are the parietal cortex, the temporal cortex here in green, the frontal cortex at the front of the brain, behind your eyes, and at the back of the head, got the occipital cortex. All of these regions are important to a greater and lesser extent to processing sensory information, depending upon what that sensory information is. What they do is and can be very complicated. I'm going to grossly simplify it down into the following. What the parietal cortex does when you receive some incoming sensory information, very basically, is the parietal cortex in yellow works out where the sensory information is coming from. The parietal cortex is also important for attention, deciding what to pay attention to and then focusing our attentional resources on the thing that we are paying attention to. The temporal cortex in green, very, very simply, helps us work out what the sensory information is and where we have seen it before. So if we see, I don't know, a picture of a teddy bear, it's the temporal cortex that tells us that it is a teddy bear. It tells us about our previous knowledge of teddy bears, what a teddy bear looks like, and how we're able to match the incoming sensory information with teddy bears that we have seen previously. The front of the brain then, every neuroscientist's favorite part of the brain, the frontal cortex tells us what to do about it, selects and plans an appropriate response, generates the motor commands, and then sends them down the cortical spinal tract, as we covered in another video. There is, as I am at pains to emphasize, a huge amount more that these cortical regions do, but very simply, if you want a simple rule of thumb about what these cortical regions do and what the consequences are of damage to them, this will do as a starting point. The region in pink then, the occipital cortex, is primarily associated with processing visual information. It's where the primary visual cortex lives. We will cover the structure and function of these cortical regions in more detail in other videos. In summary then, very basically, sensory information is processed by specialist cells, the eyes, in the ear, in the skin, for example. The transduction of these different types of sensory information follows a common pathway, the peripheral nerves into the spinal cord, into the thalamic nuclei, and then onto the cortex. Sensory information from the head, let's say the eyes and the ears, doesn't go directly through the spinal cord. It goes on to the thalamus directly. There are specific regions for processing some types of sensory inputs, such as the primary visual cortex, and most sensory systems rapidly adapt and can turn their sensitivity up or down depending upon the strength of the sensory input. Sensory information is integrated. That integration is complex. It involves both the thalamus and the cortex and other regions. And damage at any step along this pathway that we talked about in this video can and will affect sensory processing, but the presentations of those perturbations can be very different. All right, here are the image credits. All of the images were used under a fair use exemption for teaching. Any questions about the content of this video, please do just send me an email, p.newton@swansea.ac.uk, and I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.